got done again this weekend working with a team, and I'd come away from that going, man, I kind of just want to stay here. I couldn't explain it, but there was something there that I was almost longing for. And then I'm like, well, that's odd. Well, maybe at first it was like, well, maybe it's just because I connected with those guys. But then I would go to another church where maybe I didn't connect as much. And I'm like, I want to stay here. And I kept like, what is this? In fact, I went to Ryan at some point, like a year and a half ago. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on, but this is what I'm feeling. This is what's going on. Well, you come to realize, like, actually, I just needed a break. But even within my role of IBL, and God is still putting me through an interesting journey in my own life, but it's a process of sitting there saying, I can help pastors all day long and help leaders all day long. And yes, I wasn't 20 years in pastoral ministry, but for Dave Deets, I still need to be an elder in a local church.
Welcome to Pastor Scholar, Bridging the Gap, examining how academia and the church influence each other. I'm your moderator, Chris Miller. Joining me, as always, is Dr. Cory Marsh from Southern California Seminary and founding pastor of Revolve Bible Church, Ryan Day. Welcome. And we have a special guest with us today. We have Dr. Dave Deets, who is Vice President of Ministries for the Institute of Biblical Leadership, where he helps churches and organizations think through and implement changes to their structures, processes, and ministries, applying practical leadership principles from God's Word to real-world issues of ministry leadership. He holds a Master of Ministry from International Baptist College, Master of Arts in Cross-Cultural Studies from Maranatha Baptist Seminary, and a Doctorate of Ministry from Northland International University. He's also authored a new book, When Men Have Miscarriages, Finding Hope Amidst Silent Pain, in which he chronicles his own family's journey through multiple miscarriages in order to encourage men coping with similar loss. Just quickly, Dr. Deets, what inspired you to write this book?
It really was based in a lady in our church when I was pastoring in Michigan who had lost her, really what would have been grandchild. But she asked if there was something that she could give her son. And I said, no, there's not, because there's nothing written on it. And she said, well, somebody should write something on that. And I said, yeah, they really should. And then as soon as I said that, it was like the Holy Spirit, struck my heart with a knife. And so that's what began the journey of actually writing it and just talking about our journey that we've been on.
And why this title?
Well, I think it's so actually the title we adopted 7 years ago or 8 years ago now when we started it, when everything was not going crazy with society. So it was just kind of a way of saying, well, when men have miscarriages, like, let's talk about when that happens. And then the finding hope amidst silent pain is dealing with the fact that so many men don't talk about it. They're dealing with the pain and silence, and even if they don't realize there's pain, they're dealing with it.
So you're not talking about men literally having the miscarriage themselves.
I'm not talking about men literally having the miscarriage.
Some would actually critique your book thinking that, just on the title
right.
alone.
Yeah, actually, we've gotten a lot of feedback in the Christian community. It's where it's come from. Accusing me of going woke and everything else.
It's terrible.
And,
don't actually open the book and read it. Just judge it by that.
Judge it by the title.
By the title.
Yeah. I actually think it's a redemptive title because if we devoid the men from the process, we're actually just saying that's all the woman's issue, not the men. So I actually think I didn't start off thinking it was redemptive, but I think now in society, it's actually redemptive.
And how has the response been from the book? I mean, other than the woke response.
Yeah, I think it's been great. I've gotten a lot of feedback from people that have read it, and it's been an encouragement. And, I think for us, it was just a process of telling our story. And but I think it's been a lot of good feedback from guys.
It's a phenomenal book. I've read it. We've given it out at Revolve Bible Church, and everybody who has read it has had nothing but positive feedback. I love the title, When Men Have Miscarriages. That hits right there. And if you're thinking about the way that Dave intended it, it makes total sense. I had never heard of a book that actually addresses the husband's point, the husband's role when their wife has a miscarriage. They're generally kind of forgotten in the conversation.
Right. So
you're ministering to husbands, to men, to how to shepherd your wife through something, and even your own emotions through this.
Right.
Wonderfully helpful. And he's able to compact it in a brief book like this. It packs quite a punch, and it's biblical. It's incredibly encouraging, and it's been awesome to see the success of that. You were just recently on Focus on the Family talking about it, which was fun to watch.
Yeah, that was fun. They aired that a few weeks ago, and just a great experience recording that with them. And
great.
So yeah, it's been a fun journey. Certainly not what I anticipated it to be.
And for those unfamiliar with the Institute of Biblical Leadership, can you talk a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so
I can talk about what he does. He hands out pens.
That's right.
Let me look at look at these beautiful pens right. See this? My wife told me
Who are we interviewing, Cory?
look at this. IBL. No, I want to talk
Apparently,
about IBL and their pens.
produces pens.
Yeah, they do these beautiful pens. My wife gave me orders. I was not to return home after a visit with Dave without more. These are her favorite pens. So thank you. So I can come home and sleep at night now. My wife's going to let me back in the house.
You could actually keep a few of those and give them to her for Christmas.
There you go.
Well,
Oh.
when you're not putting out pens, what else are you doing at IBL?
Apparently,
thank you,
that's what we
Chris.
do best. That's right.
This is the part of podcasts everybody hates where we tell jokes and personal stories. about each
That's
other.
right. So IBL is just a ministry to come alongside of God's leaders, and that's really all it is. There's 4 major ministries that we do: coaching, consulting, counseling, training. And we are blessed to be able to travel around the country, help churches, help leaders that might be coaching them one-on-one, to have somebody from the outside that they can talk to. It might be consulting, coming alongside of a leadership team. It might be training, which is usually done in context of multiple churches or a mission agency or some group. And then counseling, which is a lot of times pastors and their wives, lay leaders and their wives need a place to turn to. And so we provide that for them as well. And then we have a whole international wing, which is separate. And we're doing training in Kenya, Uganda, Ecuador, Tanzania, India. We've been in Vietnam for a number of years. And so we train nationals so that they can learn how to train nationals. And so in about a decade's period of time, we can train about 1,000 nationals and raise up about 100 disciplers, trainers to train other nationals. And so it's really the fulfillment of the 2 Timothy 2:2 principle. And so it's a great ministry. One of the unique things, there's 2 kind of unique things about our ministry. First of all, everyone who serves on staff, and I believe even the board, has all been a client at one point of IBL. So we know what it's like, all of us, to sit at the table and have somebody serve us. Then the other unique aspect is that we do it for a no fee to the church. And so we'll provide what is called a cost summary, which is just like, here's what we expended to come do the ministry, and pray about it at, whatever you can do, help our ministry. But honestly, it's kind of like when I was pastoring, I didn't know who gave what. So I have no idea if any church has ever given anything to anything we've ever done. We just simply continue to do ministry for them. And actually, we actually only provide a cost summary when we come and physically do a ministry like in that setting. But there's hundreds of hours of outside help and counsel and guidance and stuff that we do that is just part of what we do. And so it's a great ministry. We love it, and been blessed to be a part of it, and glad to serve Revolve Bible Church.
Yeah, we love Dave Deets. Dave is a dear friend of all of ours. We've had IBL do coaching and consulting. Been a big help to our church, and Dave actually is still doing some coaching with us right now, and we're so very thankful for him, brother. We love you, and thanks for coming on the podcast
thank
today.
you. Love you guys.
Yeah.
Love you guys.
Thank you for
and-
coaching Ryan.
You love some of us.
We love some.
Let's-
of
Thank
Yeah.
you for coaching Ryan to finally be a pastor I can withstand. So
all
that's pretty.
Who's got the scholar mute button? Where'd that button go?
So well, the issue we're talking about today is what are pastors facing post-pandemic? And Dave, you deal with pastors all the time. What are some of the biggest issues that they're facing right now?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that happened, my assessment would be, and actually we joined full-time during COVID. So we transitioned out of our church, pastoring in Michigan. Actually, we made the decision, we made the announcement at the end of 2019, and then we kind of had a few months to try to ramp up, and then that's when COVID hit. But we still transitioned out. And I think I would have said prior to COVID, a lot of pastors were hanging on for dear life, but they could make it. They can, pragmatically, functionally, they could get by, but they're struggling. I think COVID was kind of like if you've got a bunch of twigs on the ground and you drop a big log and a big oak log on top of them, and it just kind of crushes them. I think COVID, what it did was it was more than what they could handle. They made it through it. I think a lot of guys, you look back at the creativity of some guys. Even, I'm not a techie, so I know what we did. I went to Walmart, I bought a little tripod, and I stuck my little Samsung phone on this tripod, and I did Facebook Live worship services. So we figured it out. But I think the consequences coming out of that are that, basically you're restarting a lot of churches from organizing and just thinking through, processing through, because so many people left, didn't come back. Things changed technologically, things changed. And so I think the pastor that was maybe at the end of his rope has just kind of struggled to kind of get back up. I think what we've seen, and you can look at some of the statistics where so many guys are stepping out of ministry and kind of done, or they're just kind of checked out in their own right. And so I think that's a lot of the things that they're dealing with post the pandemic is just trying to think about how do we reorganize, it's kind of like like a bomb went off, and now we got to figure out who's left, who's here, what are we doing, and how do we restart. And honestly, I mean, we love pastors. I mean, I was a pastor 20 years. Most pastors, this is not a knock on them, it's just how God has wired them. Most pastors are like in the moment of the week. Sunday's coming. I gotta make hospital visits. I gotta write a message or two or three or more, and I gotta deal with complaints and things. And most pastors don't have the ability to pull up to the 30,000 foot level to figure out where are we going, what are we doing, how are we gonna get there. And so they're just plodding along, and they're just trying to make it. And so I think the struggles for them is to say, how do I actually humble myself to get help, to say I need some help, come alongside of us. And I think that's what they're struggling with. I think they're struggling with one of the other things I think that they're struggling with, and at some point I think I'm going to write an article on this, but I think one of the things that's happening is social media is having a drastic impact on our pastors and even church people. I think God has designed us to be able to handle, personally, we can do 4 or 5 or 6 things really, really well. Maybe some of us have more bandwidth, but let's just say it's 4 to 6 things that we can do really well. And a church probably has 4 to 6 things that it does really well. The problem is we flip through Instagram, we flip through Facebook, we flip through all the social media, and we see, oh, Revolve Bible Church is doing that. We should do that. Then we look at that church is doing this. And now, before we know it, we've stacked 1,000 things onto the expectation list that we now think we have to do both personally as a pastor and then corporately as a church. And I think that is killing us. And that is actually unbiblical because God didn't call us or design us or equip us to do that. And so I think the social media stuff, although there's a great benefit to it, is awesome. But I think we've got to be really careful how we should, instead of looking, like if I'm scrolling through and I see something that Revolve Bible Church does, instead of looking at that and going, oh, I should be doing that, we should actually just say, wow, that's great and awesome that God is letting them do that. And I don't need to be Revolve Bible Church along with 5,000 other churches out there and putting that weight and that pressure. And so I think that's a lot of the underlying issues that pastors are going through.
Has that been true for us, would you say, Revolve Bible Church, too, in terms
No, apparently we're the standard that everybody else should be
Oh,
looking at.
well,
and
in that
Well, I
case.
mean, I
getting
can listen to
overwhelmed by
other
it. They should be doing what we're doing. Yeah.
Sorry, Chris. What was the question?
Well, coming post-pandemic, and Pastor Roy, maybe you can speak to this for Revolve Bible Church. What has been the biggest issue, would you say, just for Revolve Bible Church?
That's a good question. The pandemic was a great thing for us. As I look back, it forced us to clarify what we believed on a couple theological issues. We grew numerically during the pandemic. I think a lot of churches lost people, but what they lost, I like Al Mohler's statement, they lost the mushy middle. They lost people that maybe were making a profession of Christ, but they weren't really regenerate. Our social media ministry was born out of the pandemic. We didn't do any live streaming. We didn't do any filming of our messages until the pandemic really kind of forced us to. And so the Lord's used that to get his word out to a broader audience and use us in a small way in that. And we're really thankful for that. So from our perspective as a church, the pandemic didn't really create a whole lot of issues for us. So I hope I'm not.
No, absolutely.
So I can't really speak to that.
And getting to a recent study that more than 200, this is put out by Lifeway Research, more than 200 pastors identified 44 needs they faced in ministry, and another 1,000 pastors were surveyed to determine how common each need was in pastoral ministry. So this was done in 2022. So these were they identified 17 greatest needs or issues, and the top one that was cited, 77% was developing leaders and volunteers. Does that surprise you, Dave, at
No.
all? Hmm.
No, I think most pastors don't. Again, I think it's I'm in the day, I'm in the moment, I'm in the week. I've got to preach a message on Sunday. I've got to go visit 5 people this week in the hospital. I've got 3 people that want to talk to me about leaving the church. I'm hoping that I've got a couple people that might want to talk to me about coming to our church. And so to think about the future and being intentional in that process, I'd like to do that, but I'm not going to do that. And so we just continue to live in that cycle. And I think that's where pastors live. They don't know how to get out of that cycle, most of them.
How would you recommend that they do so?
Go work at Walmart. No, I'm just kidding. No. I think it's the biggest thing is they have to be intentional. And I think there's an issue that's going on, especially in more metropolitan areas where you've got a lot of churches in an area. Now, if you're in the rural areas, you're probably more dependent upon Christ, which is really what we should be. But I think in our metropolitan areas, I noticed this in Michigan, where we had hundreds of churches on every corner. Not they were all different stripes, but it could happen in L.A. area or San Juan Capistrano, where you guys are. Is that we play a complicated game of Red Rover? Remember when we were kids? I don't know if you remember. We played Red Rover, send somebody right over. And I think pastors have pragmatically come to the point where they say, let's play a game of Red Rover. And maybe I can go to I'm here and I can go to that church over there, and maybe I'll woo some of their leaders over here. So pragmatically I just fill a hole with the guy from over there. Now, maybe that guy at that church is really equipping leaders and doing a great job, and he's got more than what he needs, and he's happy to do that. But most of them are not doing that as far as equipping them. And so we're just sitting back, we're crossing our fingers, and we're hoping against hope that God somehow will drop, ready to go, plug-and-play leaders into our midst. And instead of saying, you know what, if God is sovereign, it's not a question, but since God is sovereign, we believe he has sovereignly brought these people to our church. Therefore, my fiduciary duty and responsibility as a pastor, biblical responsibility, is to say, I need to intentionally equip and train these people, not sitting there wishing and hoping that somebody else would show up, but say, God, I'm going to be faithful here. Now, God in blessing that faithfulness may bring ready to plug and play leaders to your church. But God expects us to be faithful and intentional in developing the leaders of people that he's brought to us. And I think we can easily look in some of our churches and go, well, have you seen the people that are in our church? Like, how are you going to make leaders out of these people? Well, I think the Bible is full of examples where God took ordinary people and did extraordinary things with them. And so,
Yeah, I think as it relates to the topic of leadership, and particularly how do you develop leaders in your local church, I think it's important to remember that leadership is a gift. It's one of the spiritual gifts that Paul lists in Corinthians or Romans, I think. But it is also something that is common to every man. God has uniquely designed men to be leaders in their homes, in their workplaces. And I think what's happening is I yes and amen everything to what Dave said, but I think a lot of churches aren't calling their men to be leaders in every sphere of their life. As men understand that the biblical word for leadership, it means to stand in front. Men need to be the ones who are taking the initiative in their homes, theologically, to protect their family, to provide for their family. Men should be the ones taking the initiative in the children's ministry. All of our elders at our church teach in our children's ministry. I think we have more male teachers in our children's ministry than we have women teachers. But that all flows from the pulpit, and it flows from highlighting and encouraging and inspiring men to be leaders in their home. From that, you then get naturally men who want to stand up and be leaders in the church.
Yeah, and I think part of this conversation has to go to how are we defining a leader? Are we defining a leader solely as an elder or a deacon, or are we defining it as somebody who is, like what Ryan said, is willing to take a stand, lead his family, lead his home, be involved in church? Maybe God hasn't called you to be an elder. Like we would argue, not everybody is called to be an elder. So don't become an elder. Don't think that you should become an elder. Now, I would argue that most men, if not all believing men, should be qualified and somehow equipped and trained to be a deacon. I think that's a biblical principle. But whether or not you have that title or position does not mean you can't lead in some way. So I think in the concept of leadership, we have to just be careful to say, are we talking about where are the elders and deacons, or are we talking about, no, actually our men step up and take the lead and take a stand, like what Ryan's saying.
The LifeRay research poll that Chris referred to, it says developing leaders and volunteers, 77%
and volunteers,
that.
yeah.
And so I think, as I read this, as they're talking about leaders, I don't think it's exclusively, at least the statistic, we're talking about elders and deacons.
Right.
Yep.
And so as I think about leaders, again, I just think that helping men, when men are leading in their everyday life, they get excited and empowered to lead in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And so naturally then men will organically start to lead in the church, but then you need to develop places for them to be equipped as leaders for the local church. But in general, I personally think that that's a reason why pastors struggle. And I would say this too on the other part. I think that going back to a previous episode we did on the seeker-sensitive church, I think that what's happened is a lot of pastors, they promote the idea of the celebrity. So the people come to church and they hear me preach, and that's the extent of church. And that's not really the work of what a biblical shepherd is. Shepherds are to teach, but they're to do more than that. They're to equip their people for the work of the ministry as well.
What do you guys think? I'm asking both of you guys in a pastoral sense. So looking at the New Testament, I can't find any place, unless I overlook something, where the church is told to train elders. It is to appoint elders, right? That's what Paul would say to Timothy and to Titus and elsewhere. We don't see this idea of pastors being trained. It seems to be there's already an assumption in the New Testament that the people you call or appoint elders are already equipped. So where do we get this idea that God has called us to equip and train future pastors or pastors within our church?
That's a great, Paul said to Timothy or to Titus, appoint elders in every city as I directed you. That's a really good question. I need to think on that.
I just wanted to put Ryan on the fly here.
Stump
I
the
know
pastor.
there's a really good answer. It's just not coming.
And
to me.
Dave has it. What is it, Dave?
So,
Yeah, so you're asking, like, God hasn't called us to train elders. He's called us to...
Maybe he has, but what's been revealed, it is this assumption that the elders that we're called to appoint elders,
Sure.
and the assumption is they're already trained or equipped.
Right.
We put such, and IBL puts, and wonderfully so, because our churches and so many others have benefited from your ministry, about equipping pastors.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how can we actually justify that by the New Testament text itself, or can we?
Yeah, I think, well... I mean,
or it's an implication, perhaps, then that's what we're holding to.
I think there's an idea that would say what IBL would like, so when we come in, just talking about us specifically, when we come in to work with a leadership team, let's just say an elder team, we're kind of looking at it as, let us continue to give you some tools and help and encouragement and things to help your team, help you as an individual leader, be the leader that God intends you to be. Like a continuing education. I mean, like, speaking in the seminary context, like a continuing education concept versus like what you're suggesting is who we put into place should already be qualified, vetted, godly men who have probably been trained and equipped through the process of time by a pastor or by scripture as they've read, so I think, and just even in the elder selection process, if we're just talking about elder selection at that point, I think we have to sit there and say, okay, I mean, so this is the other book that I wrote, which is Selecting Elders, a biblical guide to choosing God's shepherds, is we are so, I tend to think our churches are so pragmatic. So we look at it and go, dude, we need leaders, we need elders, you got warm blood flowing through you, you don't complain too much, you show up most of the time, so doggone it, why don't you be an elder? And we have cheapened.
Can you imagine? That's the standard. That's usually the standard for most churches.
That's the standard, but for most churches.
Wow.
And so
you have a pulse. You're an elder.
You have a pulse.
And you're standing here.
We got to have elders,
Yeah,
and that's
right.
even in churches that are elder led. You move out of elder led churches, it's probably even worse. And who can be in leadership and who can serve and who can do these things, because everything is so pragmatic. That's not to say that if somebody's listening to this going, okay, Dave thinks all elders and leaders are unqualified. I am not suggesting that. But I am suggesting, and I think I've got data to show in the research that I did in my dissertation, which was on the topic of elder selection, is that for the most part, we're very pragmatic. In fact, one of the statistics and it wasn't a huge survey, but one of the surveys I did, questions I asked in my dissertation writing, was how many of you, like the 70-some churches that I surveyed in our general area that had different ecclesiastical affiliations, how many of you asked doctrinal questions of your prospective elders? And two of the 70 churches said we ask doctrinal questions.
Wow.
The rest of them said
68 churches didn't.
68 out of 70.
They weren't vetting these guys theologically,
They said
doctrinally.
if you agree with our doctrinal statement of the church, we count that as good enough. Well, that violates Titus 1:9, which says that an elder has to be able to know God's word, teach God's word, and defend God's word. If you're not asking him doctrinal questions, how in the world do you know that he can defend it? So that's just a base level that we're violating. And that's why I think so many churches are pragmatic and so many elder teams they view themselves as a board of directors. And so, Ryan is the pastor, and so you got to do all four roles of the pastor. You got to be the presbyteros, and you got to be the poimen, and you got to be the episkopos, and you got to be the oikonomos. And I'm just here as the bumpers on the bowling alley to make sure you stay in line. I'm not really shepherding. I just control the church. I just show up and make decisions, and you shepherd, and you do all those things. And so I think at the base level, again, it's not every church, but I would contend a good number of them are in that boat.
I really appreciate what you had to say. I think that's really good. But as you were talking, I think I have an answer for Cory.
Oh.
You gave Ryan some time to put on his thinking
He
cap.
was looking at me. I was like, he's gonna come
He
out.
was shaking his head in
great.
agreement, thinking of something else.
As I was thinking through what you said, I think it's an argument from absence, not an explicit statement, but it is the model of Christ. Christ specifically chose 12 men. 11 of them would later become apostles. We have an example of Christ training Paul when Paul was converted, and Paul talks about being personally taught by Christ. And so I think that the model that was given to us by our Lord Jesus Christ, that was passed on to the apostles, and then the apostles in turn passed that on to the elders. And I think that was probably assumed in the New Testament because I think it was probably the apostles' lifestyle. They probably mimicked what the Lord did for them. So, yeah, we don't have a specific instance of Titus being trained or Timothy being trained, but certainly they were trained, and there had to be some level of knowledge that Timothy had for Paul to come and exhort him in 1st and 2nd Timothy, as well as Titus. They had to have some type of context to understand, which would mean there seems to be some type of training. So I think the apostolic process, if we could say that, I know that's loose language maybe, but I think there's good evidence in Scripture, not explicit language, but I think you could make a good argument that the model of developing New Testament leaders is there, and it's given to us by Christ in the Gospels. You see that in the First Commission when he sends out the 70, or he sends out the 12 before that even, or after that, I can't remember where it is, and he's training them and preparing them for how they are going to function in his absence.
Of course, someone's going to shoot back and say the apostolic office is not the same thing as a pastoral office, which I know you would hold to as well.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
So we have different gifts. Apostles and prophets are one, and pastors and teachers are different. So there is a direct, and I think I'm in agreement with you because there is a model there, obviously.
I think we all replicate the models that we're given. That's why Jesus says, be careful who you let teach you because you will become like your teachers. And I think that the apostles were no different. So absolutely, I am not saying that the office of pastor and apostle is the same, but I do think that they replicated the model that they were given. I think it was all they knew. And boom, Jesus ascends, and they're about the business, and people are getting saved. I think they're just replicating the model that Christ gave them.
So let me ask you this. This is not judgmental, and hopefully I'm not skipping out of line here.
I only answer judgmental questions.
Good. Well, then we got to listen.
I'm
And
used
he
to being
only
judged,
asked judgmental
and I only ask him to.
Well, we could go all night there because I got some judgmental. No. So was your motivation for asking that to drive into somehow saying that the scholastic academic world is doing the job that the church isn't doing, or
Pastor Scholar podcast?
I had one motivation in my question, and it was to watch Ryan squirm.
It worked.
you did a
On the
great
fly.
job because
It worked.
Well, squirming aside, can you speak to that?
No, to your question, I haven't. This is actually something I've thought about. So at Revolve, Ryan and the elders do a wonderful job of equipping the deacons and the elders as well, even bringing in an outside party such as IBL to help. And it pragmatically, in a good sense, it is I think it's foundational, it's essential, it helps equip those who are already called to the office. It started hitting me, just me, this is no one else. I could not find a place in the New Testament. I started thinking about being equipped as an elder. When you go to Paul wasn't trained as an elder. In fact, he didn't even need anybody to teach him the model of Christ. It was a direct commission. That's what the apostles had, which is why I push back maybe a little bit against the apostolic model versus the pastoral one. It is something silent in the New Testament. We don't have any explicit injunctions for pastors to be trained. They're already assumed to be that. We do for deacons. I'm looking at 1 Timothy 3:10, and let them also be tested first. And if they prove themselves blameless, then they should serve as deacons. That testing and all that would be part of the training aspect, but you don't see that for elders, which is odd to me. And it's just a curiosity. I wonder why the New Testament doesn't have that.
You could connect though that that final thought in 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 8 or verses 1 through 7 with the word
Sure.
likewise in verse 8, right?
Sure, exactly. And I think that would be a good case to make. That it's connected from that unit of thought, verses 8 about deacons. It goes back to likewise all the things with elders should be applying to here as well. So that would be a good case. It's just not as explicit, but yeah, I think that'd be legit.
So implicit.
But as much emphasis as we place on training elders, which is almost taken as an assumption in churches that care about it, it just hit me that there's not so much. It's not proportionate to the commands or in scripture that we have to do that.
I think going back to, and this, I appreciate you saying that because I can clarify maybe my point, and I'd love to hear Dave's thoughts on this, is that I think what has happened in American evangelicalism is, as you were saying, we have become so pragmatic, not only as it relates to what we do with the elders, but we've also just become pragmatic in general. And so as a result, churches aren't training leaders or equipping people maybe as they should have been. Churches have devolved, if I can use that language, into providing entertainment and providing a service, not to worship God, but for people. So we're behind the curve. So we're getting all these people, and we can't select from anybody to appoint them because nobody knows anything.
And Dave, you brought up an excellent example. Like the standard you're seeing some of these churches are so low. If you have a pulse, you have a heartbeat, and you're standing there, we need elders, you get to serve. Oh. And I can speak to that. I just had a conversation with a very good friend of mine who was very theologically astute. We served together before. We've even helped plant a church before. And he's dealing with that in his own church right now, that there's one of the elders that is, it seems to not be, fulfilling any of the requirements of being an elder, but they need the elders because they're a small, tiny church. Mm-hmm. They need the structure there of leadership. So it becomes almost like, haphazard, selecting men that perhaps out of convenience as opposed to, those that are biblically qualified.
The sad thing about that is that ends up working against that church.
Sure. Exactly.
And it is in this circumstance.
Because it confuses the people, and the people don't have clarity on what elder.
And I think it's... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you, talk on that, but I'd love to hear your thought on why do you think that there's such a need for training? How do we get here?
How did we get here? I think just over time, we lowered the standard. We got pragmatic. We just continued to not invest in our men the way we intended to. I think consumerism took over. I also think, honestly, part of it is the resurgence of eldership in the last, 50 years. You look historically, back at the end of the, history-wise, Southern Baptist churches had elders, but that was back in the end of the 1700s, 1800s, and then it kind of went on this weird gap for a while, and then it's suddenly resurrected. We love and appreciate the 9 Marks and all the stuff that they've done, but honestly, Dever and those guys were kind of some new pioneers in the new vision and view of eldership. So I think we're living in a world where this has been a relatively hot topic in the last 20, 30 years. But for years prior, I don't think that there was much in the way of eldership in churches.
Now, do you think that – I have 2 thoughts to that. Number one, do you think that that's a result of bad polity leading to frustrated people in churches? And then maybe my second question is I think some of our Presbyterian brothers who separate out ruling elders versus teaching elders, they would say, hey, we've always
Yeah,
been
right.
here. But I would maybe say to them, I think you saying there's actually different kinds of
Yes.
elders has contributed to that problem.
Yeah, I think that could be a whole podcast that we could talk about, which would be interesting to do. And we would want to represent them fairly in that process. I think when I was doing this, so this is just interesting, and I'm going to be recalling my dissertation, which was literally 10 years ago, and I haven't read it since I wrote it. So this is always dangerous. But if you go back and look at the history of kind of where we broke into some of this polity stuff, it actually, like Robert's Rules of Order and all that stuff, rooted into Civil War, pre-Civil War time frame, where the whole concept was, how do we present fairness in the local church? How do we make sure that the poor people have as much say as the rich people? So then we came up with Robert's Rules of Order to say, well, now we govern ourselves by that, as opposed to just saying, well, what does the Bible teach us about how do we govern our churches and how do we lead our churches? And so I think that period of time led us on a interesting journey. And you're right, the Presbyterians, others, probably the Brethren would be in that mix too, where they would say, hey, we kind of had it right theoretically all along. But when you're looking at Baptist background, Bible background, anything like that would nowadays have eldership, I think this is a new concept. So now it's a hot topic to say, well, why do we need to train guys? It's because we had this years of silence in this area that I'm not thinking about, I got to have elders. I'm thinking about, I went to seminary or I went to college, and so I'm trained. I'm going to come in. I'm going to preach. I'm going to do my thing. And if I got a guy, all I need is a guy to serve as a deacon. Of course, in the Baptist church that I grew up in, the deacons served as kind of the elders, although they didn't want to, because that's not how God had called them. So we kind of forced them to serve as elders. And so we're telling them, you got to have a shepherding group. And these guys are like, I don't want to shepherd. That's not how God. No, you're going to have a shepherding group. I'm sorry, that's what a deacon is. No, that's not what a deacon does. But the Baptist churches that I was part of kind of had their polity. I'll just say it. It was messed up. It wasn't biblical. We forced men to do a role that they weren't called to do. And now we're trying to figure out how do we do this. And so then you had a group of deacons. Then this is my background. You had a group of deacons who said, you know what, fine, we're going to control the church then. We're going to take it over. We were here before you came. We'll be here after you left. So you preach and we'll run the place.
That was deacon-led churches.
That was now
Wow.
deacon-run,
Yeah.
deacon-led churches.
Mhm.
And so, for me, that journey out of that world into trying to understand an elder world, sometimes I'm like, it's not that much different. We just call them different titles. But we haven't done a good job of training and preparing our elders, just like they didn't do a good job of actually putting the right people in the right place.
Let me insert here. This is a good case for seminaries. If we're doing our parachurch ministry to come alongside the church, perhaps the training does conveniently happen in a good seminary for that church to appoint that elder who's been trained, at least in some sense, right? I mean, if the church is now in the business of not training or having a lack of qualified men to be able to point to elders, and they're not doing the work of training or they're not doing the work of equipping in any sense, and wait for that perfect elder to come along, then that does justify the need for Bible colleges and seminaries to do some type of intensive training that the local church just isn't doing. And if they're doing their role rightly, being a parachurch ministry, they are submitting themselves to the local church, right? And coming alongside the church and helping fuel or provide men that have been vetted, at least theologically and doctrinally, to be able to say, okay, this man is now at least intellectually qualified and spiritually, from what we can gather, now you can feel perhaps more confident.
It's an interesting question. I came from a church tradition that espouses the Moses model of leadership, or so it's coined, and back then, at least, the majority of pastors were not formally trained, and formal education was frowned upon. Was that your experience in the world that you came from, or those guys were educated?
They were educated. The main guy was educated. That was highly sought after.
But they still
the application
had
was
a poor polity.
Yeah, because I think for me, it wasn't until I was, probably 12 years ago it was going to Shepherd's Conference and hearing the word elder. I grew up in a system that elder would have been a swear word. Like, I would have gotten probably in more trouble by talking about eldership. That would have been something we wouldn't have discussed. We wouldn't have said, because I remember being told, how can you have a multiple number of guys lead a church? That's chaos. We don't have chaos around here. And I remember asking one of my professors.
We do at RBC, by the way.
That's right. I remember
We're all about chaos.
Chaos Bible Church. I remember asking one of my professors, I said, how do we justify not having elders? How do we justify one single man who has all the authority? And he said, well, if you look in Acts, James is the pastor of at the church of Jerusalem. And I said,
Well, that's all you got.
that's all you got. And I wasn't that honestly, I didn't have anything else, but I was thinking like, okay, this guy's been part of the system for a number of years. He goes, yeah, that's all we got. That we're basing our entire polity view on the fact that James was the pastor of the church of Jerusalem. And so at that point, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that sounds weird. And then it was shortly after that I kind of began on this journey of eldership. And then I'm going, wait a minute. Like, if you actually just read the Bible, if you actually just read the Bible, you would see that every time the elder is used, it's always used in a plural context, unless it's talking about a specific elder. You see in fact, you've got a bigger uphill battle to argue for a single-headed pastor model
There
than you do
is
the plurality.
no exegetical evidence in the New Testament for a single pastor over a church, I think.
James was a pastor at Acts.
But I got two things. Hey, one, there actually is, and I know you'll agree with me, and I'll get there in a second. But real quickly, it's funny in that particular example. Not only is it bad to base your entire polity on one descriptive portions of Scripture, but James is explicitly called elsewhere an apostle and the Lord's brother, never called a pastor.
Good point.
So say he's the senior pastor of a church, like that is exegetically unwarranted. In fact, it would be more the converse. He was a case to be made for him being an apostle of the Church of Jerusalem, perhaps, but not a pastor. And two, and I know you'll agree with me on this, Ryan, there is a senior pastor named in 1 Peter 5. The literal Greek word is chief shepherd. It's to get one Greek word, and we would take that out as senior pastor. It's funny how men take that title from Christ. They don't take Lord, I'm the Lord of the church, because we all know Jesus is, right? But they'll take senior pastor, but Jesus himself, as Peter describes him, is called
I
the
admit it,
chief
you
shepherd.
totally got me. I was sitting here thinking like, wait a minute, what did I miss? And then you're right.
It's
I totally
Christ.
agree
and
with
as
you.
you know, we're as pastors, we're under shepherds of the chief pastor, the senior pastor. There's one senior pastor, it's Jesus himself.
And 1 Peter 5 is a great example because Peter is saying there in verse 1, as a fellow elder, simpres buteros, as an
right.
apostle,
Yeah.
I'm a fellow elder with you. So he's setting aside his apostolic role
Amen.
to
That's
say,
right.
I'm a fellow brother with you.
Perfect example.
That's right.
And leadership too. I mean, so many, like with the Moses model, and because they're not being able to, or not, like you say, intentionally developing elders, so many are experiencing ministry burnout. And so many are having mental health challenges. I mean, we've seen this back to that study. 63% of respondents say they are stressed. 66% struggle with trusting God. Is that been your experience? Have you seen that yourself?
Oh, yeah. I think even the guys that do have elders are stressed and frustrated because they've got pragmatically placed guys. Again, not everybody. I'm not suggesting that all elders. I've got 5 at Revolve that would probably.
I was gonna say, if my elders were listening right now, I'd say, you all stress and burn me out.
They would say the same thing, right?
They're gonna give me heat for that.
Right.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, you want to talk about stress and burnout? You gotta. Our
You want
when
to
I
talk
was-
about stress and burnout? Be a passenger while Ryan's driving here to LA in a car. You'll get car sick in 25 minutes.
He
and
can
be
go
really
on and
stressed
on about
out.
that.
I think I stress our elders.
My
out.
wife is gonna see this and punch me. She'd be, I told you.
Chris is keeping a good smile. Inside, he's like, oh my word, these 3 guys.
Chris balances us out. That's what he's doing on that side of the table.
I
He's
try.
we're
I
wibbling and wobbling,
try.
and he's balancing us. Oh, yeah.
This thing could go south really fast.
He's the silent majority over there. Is what it is.
You'll notice my glazed over look.
Like, I don't know. Question number 5.
That's how I know that's why I sit there usually,
Right.
and I look at Chris, and when he gets glazed over, I know it's time to move on. Yeah.
Time to go. Yeah, I think a lot of guys, even if they have elders, they got to know how to deal with. They got to not deal with. They got to know how to work with their elders. They've got to know how to have proper roles and relationships and responsibilities with elders. So it's not just a pragmatic, hey, we have elders. There's a lot of churches that have elders. That does not mean that they're functioning right. And so those guys are not board of directors. They are fellow pastors, fellow shepherds along with you. And then like what we did in our church, a smaller church, but we got to the point where it was frustrating because we hadn't really assigned roles and responsibilities. And so we'd come to an elders meeting and all 4 of us would say, oh, I talked to this person about this topic. And I'm like, this is not effective or efficient. And so it doesn't matter that you don't get a paycheck from the church, but this is your role. And this is your role. And this is your role. And this is my role. And so then what we did is we just treated them like, let's just, like, because if somebody gets a paycheck, it's, well, this is the pastor of, family ministry or youth, or Well, because he gets a paycheck, so we can think about that. I'm like, it doesn't matter if he gets a paycheck. Let's just define roles and responsibilities. Then we can say, okay, you're the pastor of care and our prayer and care ministry. You're kind of handling our small groups, and you're the pastor of our family ministry, and you're the pastor of outreach, and I'm the main teaching guy, but I do other things. And now we can communicate to the church, hey, here, if you got an issue with our small groups, go talk to Cory. If you got an issue with a family thing, go talk to Ryan. Now we're actually utilizing our men well. It's not just about having, quote unquote, like backup singers. It's about saying these are fellow pastors, fellow elders who have jobs and roles and responsibilities, and we figured out how to utilize them, and that's going to help a lot with the burnout. I mean, like our church of we were 150 people. We had at one point, we had 4 elders who were doing, so my hat is off. I know Ryan and I have talked about this. I don't know if he's going to agree with what I'm about ready to say, but my hat is off to the lay guys. For me,
Absolutely, I agree.
it
with
was hard. It was easy for me because honestly, 24/7 church was all I did. And so for me, my brain thinks I could focus on church. But for some of these guys, they're running businesses. They're doing a lot of other things that is sucking up a lot of their time and energy. And then we're asking them, hey, do you give us 10, 15, sometimes 20 hours a week to serve at the church? So my hat's off to the lay guys. But to be able to utilize them in an appropriate manner, I think is a big key for these guys. So a pastor will sit there and say, I'm really frustrated and I'm burned out and I've got all this work to do. And then you ask them, well, what are your elders doing? Well, what do you mean, what are they doing? Well, they come to a meeting once a month and they make decisions. That is not an elder. That's not a pastor. And so they should be shepherding and they should have oversight and they should be able to steward along with you and they should be able to be the episkopos role. And so we've got to train and really help our pastors to know how do we work with this team. And I mentioned to Ryan the other day, he has rubbed off on me because I've adopted his lingo that he uses, which I'll let him take credit for.
Let's hear it.
That we move, we shoot, we communicate together.
Right, yes.
I've become and
we got a stack of dead bodies at our church to prove it. Just kidding.
To clarify, shooting means accomplishing the task that God has given us to do.
That's right. Yeah. So no, I really appreciate that because I know Ryan pounds that at Revolve. And to be able to say, we're a team. This isn't Ryan with his backup guys who meet once a month and, you shouldn't have spent that much money. You shouldn't. These are guys who are saying, I mean, you go to Philippians chapter 1, verses like 24, 25, 26, 27 in there. Maybe it's 27 through 30, where Paul says we are linked arm in arm, striving side by side for the gospel. And we need to have elder teams and then elder deacon teams that are linked arm in arm who are saying, you know what, I may not be able to do 24/7 because I've got an actual, not an actual job, not like you don't have a job. I've got another job, but man, I am linked arm in arm together with you. And I think the reason why we have pastors who have burnout is because they don't know how to link arm in arm with their fellow elders and their fellow deacons.
Awesome point. I absolutely think that not knowing how to function as a true plurality is one of the reasons for burnout. I would add to that, I think that a lot of guys in ministry that quit were never actually called. They were attracted to the ministry for one reason or the other, and it didn't meet their expectations. And so they quit, and they're much happier doing something else. And I think today that's kind of called burnout a little bit. There is a reality to not being able to stop. When you're got your hand to the plow, you don't look back. Paul said that he was under compulsion. And I honestly very much just feel that way. There is a drive in me. It's not something I have worked up. My wife always looks at me and says, you'll never be happy doing anything else. The Lord has put this drive in me that I find great joy. It's like, what was that famous runner? He said he found the pleasure of God when he ran. Remember that guy, the famous Olympian Christian guy that made a movie about him?
Oh, Chariots of Fire.
Yeah, and
Yes,
and he talked about feeling like he was really doing exactly what God had made him to do. That's how I feel about ministry. I think the other thing too is why guys feel burnout is kind of along the lines of what Dave was saying. Not just not linking arms with other guys, but particularly not making the margin in their life that they need to make to accomplish what God has called them to accomplish. It's a lot of stress being a pastor. It's a lot of burden being in the work of the ministry. And elders need to realize that they can't accomplish what they want to accomplish. They can only accomplish what God has asked them to accomplish. And then they need to find the appropriate margin to do that. And going back to what Dave said earlier, is we're trying to do everything. And we need to just be faithful to do what God has called us to do, and not try to necessarily do everything the guy down the street is doing. This podcast is a great example. This is something that our church produces, but it's because of you. It's because of the 4 guys in the other room that kind of came together and said, hey, why don't we do a podcast? And I was like, hey, my bandwidth is split. I can't do that. And you're like, it's cool. We got it. And so we haven't said this on the podcast yet, but Chris writes the questions. Our team in the back is editing. They're promoting it. We're working together to
shout out to Matt and John.
Shout out to Matt and
us.
John. Shout out to Matt and John. And Cory too. Cory's a full-time scholar, and he's a full-time professor. And
I didn't get paid for the gas getting up here, and I bought everybody Starbucks. I didn't get paid for that.
You didn't buy me Starbucks.
Well, you came in with Starbucks. I said that. You were already appointed with your Starbucks. You weren't trained for the Starbucks.
Right.
I was thinking, Ryan, and looking back in this conversation of burnout with pastors, one very clear matter that became very clear for me recently when we had IBL. Institute for Biblical Leadership out at the church, and Dave Deets came and Joel Tetro. And one thing that I would think helped with you guys as elders, because it certainly did with us as deacons, and looking at the process being a part of it, was, and you brought up the role clarification, just everybody knowing their lane, where they're at. I think that probably relieved a lot of pressure, right, on the team and even on your own shoulders.
We had that, but Dave and Joel helped us take it to the next level. The way that it works at our church is that once someone becomes a deacon or an elder, they have a meeting with our elder chairman, which is Cory Scheid. And Cory sits down, and together that deacon and that elder with Cory develops their roles and expectations, their R&Es. So we don't say you're doing this and that you just have to do it. They work together to come up with what is a reasonable expectation for them to accomplish in their role and how it fits into the body. And that's extremely helpful, because once we do the R&Es, we just realize, okay, that guy does that, and I don't have to think about it.
You're not putting expectations on one of the pastors that you shouldn't be, because this other one is able to handle that.
And the other beautiful thing about it is the church takes on its own I don't know what the word I'm looking for, its own personality. Churches tend to mimic their pastors' personalities, and that is more true of churches where the pastor tries to have his hand in everything. It's less true of churches where I had a pastor tell me one time, don't hire guys and tell them what to do, hire talent and let them do what God has called them to do. And ever since I had that ministry mind shift, our church has changed. Our church is less a reflection of me, and I believe we're becoming more of what God has intended us to be as a body of believers. And so it's really exciting as a shepherd when you really get a hold of that concept and you start to unleash people, and God raises up people to do, and then you see them succeeding at what God has called them to do, and they're finding joy and finding their stride. And then the church doesn't become a celebrity situation or all about the teaching of one guy. And
yeah, I want to push back, not push back, but clarify a little bit. Like when Ryan talked about the guys who are burned out and leave probably weren't called. That's a true aspect, but I know in my own life. So it's been an interesting journey, because I was in pastoral ministry for 20 years. Then I moved into IBL, and quite honestly, I was happy to leave the not the church necessarily, but I just needed a break. The church we were at in Denver, a lot of stuff had gone on and changed and things that we had done. And then coming into the church in Michigan, and just a lot, over a 12-year period, a lot of stuff. And so I was kind of ready for a break, to say, okay, if I don't ever pass. In fact, I had to bring myself to say, can I move into IBL knowing I'm not going to be pastoring? And I'm like, yeah, I miss the every week preaching series, all that stuff. And I got into IBL about a year or year and a half, and I started having these weird feelings, like when I would work with an elder team. And I remember I would come away from a weekend, like we just got done again this weekend working with a team, and I'd come away from that going, man, I kind of just want to stay here. There's something, I couldn't explain it, but there was something there that I was almost longing for. And then I'm like, well, that's odd. Well, maybe at first it was like, well, maybe it's just because I connected with those guys. But then I would go to another church where maybe I didn't connect as much. And I'm like, I want to stay here. And I kept like, what is this? In fact, I went to Ryan at some point, like a year and a half ago. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on, but this is what I'm feeling. This is what's going on. Well, you come to realize, like, actually, I just needed a break. But even within my role of IBL, and God is still putting me through an interesting journey in my own life, but it's a process of sitting there saying, I can help pastors all day long and help leaders all day long. And yes, I was in 20 years in pastoral ministry, but for Dave Deets, I still need to be an elder in a local church. And I've got to figure out how to make that work. Because even now, and we've had some things that we thought were going to happen and they didn't happen. And now we're on a different journey with that. But even within that, it's like, I can't not pursue this. And I think that goes back to that 1 Timothy 3:1. If whoever desires the office of the bishop in King James, that's what I grew up memorizing. Whoever desires, I'm the only one who doesn't have a Bible up here, like Chris doesn't. But whoever desires the office of the bishop desires a good thing. That word desire means to reach out and snatch. You can't not do this. But it doesn't mean that there's not a time period that maybe you need to go, I need a break. And I think that was for me. I backed out, but then it was because I honestly thought when I joined IBL, I thought, oh, good, that's in the rearview mirror. I'm not, 20 years, I did my thing, and I'm good. I'm going to do this. And then all of a sudden, I'm dealing with some personal stuff going, what is this longing? Like, what is this? I'm busy. It's not like I need something more to do, but this longing that even now I cannot escape. I cannot just turn my back on. And so I think the guys do need a break. But if they're called, they're going to get back into it.
Thank you for that. That's a great point of clarification. I was not trying to say the guys that need a break are not qualified. I was talking about the guys that they get out and they never want to get back in.
They exit
and
stage left
and they're glad.
gone.
And that's not you, brother.
No.
One other thing I also want to get to, and this was just a interesting statistic. The Dr. George Barna and the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University just released a report about the devastating effects of COVID-19, and church attendance has dropped from 39% of adults attending a Christian church service at least once a week to now 33%. 56% of Americans now attend church infrequently or not at all, and millennials, Gen Xers have been least likely to attend church after the pandemic, and even Americans who identify as Christians have, their biblical worldview has declined by a third, and Americans, again, 77% to now 68%, just a general decline in, viewing the world through that biblical lens. And so you see it too, that link between a decline in church attendance, you're not going to church, you don't have a biblical worldview, now you're not seeing the world anymore through a biblical lens. And this is, again, what pastors are facing today, that their churches are, they're watching people leave their church. People haven't come back from the pandemic. And as a result, so many people are just becoming increasingly illiterate, biblically illiterate.
I think I wonder how the churches that did their best to stay faithful and open during the pandemic, I wonder how they're faring compared to the ones, attendance-wise, compared to the ones that did say close and, did not allow in-person worship service, all that stuff. That just, I don't know. This is just off the top of my head. I really am wondering if there's some type of metric to show those who stayed open, this is their attendance now. Not that attendance is a great measure for everything, but it is an indicator. And those churches that closed during the pandemic and went completely online, now they're open back up, struggling to get people in. I wonder where their attendance is, compared to the ones that stayed open during the pandemic.
I don't have any data, but out of all the churches that I know that stayed open, they grew.
That's what I'm thinking. My assumption is that's just staying faithful and consistent to the whole thing.
And in us as well, because it forced, one of the things I said earlier, or maybe it was in another podcast, but I talked about we learned a lot during COVID. One of the things that we learned was that we need to teach our people a healthy ecclesiology all the more. We had already been doing that as a church. And so the pandemic for us was an opportunity to say, let's look at what Scripture says about why you need to be involved in a local church, including worshiping week in and week out. And that helped instill this conviction in our people that they absolutely need the local church, and we grew from it. So for us, the pandemic was an opportunity. It was an opportunity for on a lot of fronts, but one of them was to highlight the need. So we didn't lose anybody, so we didn't have to get anybody back. And all in the churches that I know, the Bible teaching churches that stayed open, the ones, virtually all of the ones that I'm familiar with, they had the same experience. Now there were like I have a friend who's a pastor of a church, and they lost, I think he told me like 40%. You know this person, because they all moved out of California, and so yeah, you had that during the pandemic. I think some people that were maybe looking to leave and they saw that as their opportunity, but it wasn't a theological thing. I suspect that a lot of the churches or pastors that are being pulled in that Barna study, it's what they lost is they lost nominal believers. I don't think that they lost true believers. You don't have to teach true believers to read the Bible. We crave Scripture like a newborn baby craves milk. You don't have to teach a true regenerate believer to go to church because they want to be around the people of God. And so people that don't want to be at church, I always suspect, is there some type of relational sin that I'm not aware of as the pastor in my congregation? Or B, I'm always asking the question, does this person really know the Lord? Because you cannot love Jesus but not like his people. That's like trying to tell me that you love me but you hate my wife, or you love me or you hate my kids. That doesn't make any sense.
We love Allison, but we hate you.
Yeah, well, okay. Actually, that makes a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that for us, Ryan.
You're welcome, Allison.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I would agree with you. I've never seen any data.
That's
though.
what. So I was suspecting that very thing. It'd be interesting to get that data, but we could be wrong. But I would think almost the Lord faithful, rewarding those churches stayed faithful to Him, aren't struggling to the extent to get people back from the pandemic as those churches that closed everything, capitulating to the government mandates without even questioning it, and everything just went online. I would suspect that those who stayed open are consistent with their attendance before, maybe even grown a little bit, but not, and maybe there are some, but not have lost their people like the ones that closed and trying to get them back.
Yeah,
You know?
and I think if we did lose people, it was the nominal. It was the people that were like, actually, I don't even know why I'm going to church.
Now I have a good reason not to.
Yeah,
Right.
That's my take.
So to wrap up, and I'll just go around. What would you say to encourage pastors today? Pastor Ryan, we'll begin with you. We'll just go around.
Encourage pastors for what?
Today, just to encourage them in ministry.
Ah.
What would you say to pastors to encourage them in ministry?
I would say find joy in the task and not in the product. My mandate is to preach the word, to preach the gospel. And it's easy to get discouraged because of social media, like Dave said, and the temptation to do all these other things, and to look at your brother down the street and say, well, how come God's not doing this here? And I've had to learn that the Lord has given me, He's been so kind to me to allow me to work in His field, and being faithful to Him and that call needs to be enough. And so I would just encourage pastors, enjoy the work and let the results be up to the Lord. That's easy to say. It's hard to do. But I do think it's true.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Ryan just said. I have an interesting perspective being a professor, so the majority of my students, or at least a lot of them, are working pastors and chaplains and missionaries, and I've come to find out how isolated they are. My encouragement would be to make sure that you are vulnerable with other pastors, with other workers in the ministry, and don't think that this is your isolated task. Help others bear the burden as well. So be open to be able to speak to other churches, or other pastors perhaps, or those who are called to be able to help the burden be borne, even among your own staff. Don't feel like you have to be the Protestant Pope, if you will, the glorified senior pastor that nobody can get to know because he's the model. That's too much for any man to bear. It should be a plurality. And open yourself up to your people, to your fellow pastors, and discuss these things, and you'll find encouragement like, hey, I'm not alone in this task.
Can I say two things on that? Because I so agree with that. When we share our burdens one to another, it bonds us together. And when we're in a church and we're just acting as professionals, I love Piper's words, brothers, we are
We're
not professionals.
Yeah.
But when we actually open up and share our burdens with each other, it bonds us together. Men in particular struggle to do that if they think that they're going to be attacked or judged for opening up. Men will open up if they know it's a safe place, and that happens when you spend time developing relationships. I so appreciate that comment. Having relationships with your fellow pastors, with your fellow laborers, is absolutely key. I appreciate that so much. Thanks for saying that.
I think there's two things I would say. First of all, the joy of the Lord is my strength, kind of a little bit of what Ryan said. Finding our sufficiency in Christ, and that's a Sunday school answer, but I think that's the reality of what gets us through all the crud of ministry. And I know we've probably said a lot of stuff that if you're a pastor listening, you're like, wow, those guys were harsh. But man, my hat's off to pastors. I
Yeah.
know that on July 13th, 2020, was the day after I resigned officially as pastor of Whitneyville Bible Church. Literally, I could feel like this weight lifted off of me. Like I just felt lighter that I didn't realize I was carrying. Like I wouldn't have known that was there. But on July 13th, 2020, to say I'm no longer the pastor of Whitneyville Bible Church, and that weight of shepherding and caring for and loving those people and preaching and all that stuff was there. And so there's a lot of guys who are bearing underneath that burden, and they don't even know it's there. Find your joy in the strength of God, the sufficiency of Christ. And then I think the second thing I would say is trust the fact that God is a righteous judge, that you will stand before him and give an account, and God doesn't forget and oversee. Psalm 103:14 reminds us of the fact that he knows our frame, and he remembers that we are but dust. And God knows everything we're going through. God knows every problem, every trial, every anonymous letter that you have gotten, every issue that you're facing, and he is a righteous judge. And in this world, you will have troubles, and you will face issues, and you will face criticisms, and some of it is founded. We know all of us are failed. But you're going to face unwarranted criticisms and pushback and all that stuff. And Satan is going to be there knocking on your head saying, look at that. You're a failure. You're a loser. You're worthless. How could God love you and trust you and use you? And it's not to excuse our sin when we've sinned, but it's to say God is a righteous judge. And I know that someday I'm not standing before these people in my congregation. I'm standing before the senior shepherd. Right. I'm standing before him. He is a righteous judge. And so I'm going to find my joy in the strength of the Lord because I find my sufficiency in him, and I'm going to trust that he is a righteous judge, that he will make all things right, and I can serve him. And that maybe that's simple, but that's honestly where I'm at, and that's what gets me through.
Well, on that note, thank you, Dr. Deets, for joining us. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for tuning in.